Hello and welcome to the video Zero to Hero. My name's Dayeh and I'm a professional clarinetist here in San Diego. For today's video, I want to just walk you through some ideas that I have about how to practice more efficiently and effectively, how to approach difficult music, how to learn music, how to approach orchestral excerpts, whether it's for a youth orchestra audition, an actual audition, a college audition, and some ideas about developing and maintaining good light articulation, and some ideas of how you can get through a long rehearsal or a long practice session. So let's begin with how I approach and start learning a new piece of music, whether it's an orchestral excerpt, a small chunk of music, a sonata, a concerto, whatever it is. The first thing I like to do is, before I play a single note, I just sit down with the piece and just read it with my eyes and a pencil. So it's really important to read through a piece with your eyes to start to absorb it, and read through it, marking any notes that you need to mark, marking any fingerings you need to mark, marking any rhythms that are tricky, but also, even more importantly, is parsing through it and picking out bits and pieces of patterns that are comfortable, patterns that you know. One important aspect about playing anything or sight reading is a lot of what we play is based on patterns, bits and pieces of scales, bits and pieces of arpeggios, bits and pieces of thirds, etc. This is why all your teachers, your private teachers, your band teachers are always telling you to practice your scales, because everything you play is bits and pieces of that. And the more you can recognize those in a piece of music or an excerpt or whatever it is, the easier it becomes to play, and the easier sight reading then becomes. So before I play anything, again, I always go through it with my eyes only and a pencil, just marking things. You'd be surprised how effective quiet mental practice is. Practicing doesn't have to be loud. We don't have to make a sound when we practice. A lot of really good, effective practice is done quietly and just in here, mentally. That's all it is. Practicing this way is really effective because it forces you to go through all the motions in your head, reinforcing everything you normally do with your hands and your air and your tongue and all that stuff. So mental practice, really, really effective. And mental practice you can do anywhere. You can do in the car, you can do while you're laying down at night trying to fall asleep, except I think it'll keep you up. But again, you can do that anywhere. So the next thing is, I like to listen to a handful of recordings, not to play copycat and copy what the recording artists are doing, but just to get an idea of what is commonly done in a specific section or movement, where people normally slow down and speed up, just to see what's appropriate and to get an idea of what tempos are appropriate, or a range of tempos that people do. So again, we don't listen to recordings to copy other people. We listen to recordings to get an idea of what is common and what's not. And then by listening to recordings, you can start to pick and choose what different ideas you like from different people, and start to incorporate those into your own playing. So listening to a lot of recordings of the same piece gives you a greater understanding of that piece, but also enables you to start kind of developing your own sense of musical style. And then finally, once I've done all that, then I start to play through it. The first time I ever play through a piece, I avoid rhythms. I just play through the notes, just the notes, worrying about getting the notes right, getting all the little intervals and things correct, getting all the fingerings correct, deciding which fingerings I'm using if a passage is particularly cumbersome or tricky in the fingers. I always do that before I start to do any sort of rhythm. And again, doing that, getting all those notes in your fingers and in your brain before you play it for real is really important. What we're doing is called patterning. We're getting our fingers used to playing these notes in this order before we start to do them to a specific rhythm. So I want you to remember that muscle memory doesn't discriminate. Muscle memory will remember anything you give it. So if you're feeding your muscle memory passages with little mistakes and flaws here and there, your muscle memory is going to remember that. So it's really important that when you're learning or patterning or muscle memorizing something, that you're doing it with as few mistakes as possible, so that when you go to play it, you will have the right patterns and right fingerings and things in your technique to just spit it right back out. And then when I do start to play it and learn it, actually play it and learn it, I decide my goal tempo for a specific movement or section or whatever it is, and I go down, I cut it down to half, and that's where I start. So if a particular movement is to be played at 120 beats per minute, I'll start at 60, nice and slow and relaxed, so that again I can learn everything really correctly, I can learn everything perfectly, I can start to muscle memorize it, and then from there I can start speeding it up little by little. When you do start to speed things up, one thing I like to do is move your tempos a small amount at a time so that you don't feel the change. For example, if I'm really close to being at my tempo of 120 and I'm stuck at 112, for example, here's 112 and here's 120. You can hear a little bit of that difference, but if I go from 112 to 114, here's 112, here's 114, I'm not sure you can hear that difference. And then again from 114 to 116. Again, the difference is very small. And then from 116 to 118, etc., etc. So that we don't feel that jump from 112 to 120, but we feel it little by little. And if you're getting really close to that and you're practicing something really difficult, one idea is to aim to get a new tempo every practice session. So I'm starting today practicing this at 112. By the end of today, I want to play it perfectly at 114. And then tomorrow I'll start at 114, get it up to 116, etc. So little by little, day by day, and you will have just excellent technique and just have a really solid, grounded understanding of whatever it is that you're playing. All right, let's move on. Now, approaching orchestral excerpts. This is something that you might have done or you might have to do when you're auditioning for a youth orchestra or a school orchestra or something, or even a college audition or a professional audition. So orchestral excerpts, obviously you'll learn them the same way as you'll learn everything else, but with orchestral excerpts comes a great deal of context that you must know. And this idea of context is really important. Context means everything that's going on while your particular passage or excerpt is being played. So for example, let's take the excerpt from Mendelssohn's A Midsummer Night's Dream. This is the scherzo movement. And the clarinet, if you've played this before, you know that you're required to tongue very quickly, tongue really lightly, tongue very quietly. All these things have to be done at the same time. But why is this excerpt specifically asked and not another section of this piece? This has to do with context. So while you're playing all these notes and tonguing all these notes and doing all these dynamics and acrobatics, you've got to be aware of what's happening while you're playing in the orchestra so that you can really understand why you have to play this piece this way and do all these things at the same time. So for example, again, this scherzo from Mendelssohn's A Midsummer Night's Dream, the excerpt is usually at the beginning of the piece, and this excerpt requires you to know that you're really not the important voice here. This is a harmony with you, second clarinet, and the flutes as well. So the flute is the main voice here, and your supporting role. And if you know that, that will help dictate your dynamics, that'll help dictate your articulations. There are moments where the clarinet is prominent, and when you know all these moments, you know when to play out, you know when to back off. And we gain this understanding of context by listening to recordings, but more importantly by looking at a score. So score study, when you're learning orchestral excerpts, is really, really important because that's where a lot of your answers lie. You'll see in the score that, oh, the clarinet is marked pianissimo, the flute is a different dynamic, or, oh, I'm the harmony, the flute is the main voice, things like that. And you'll see where you can play out, where you're the only one playing, or where you need to back off because you're playing harmony and supporting role. Another example of context that's really important is the excerpt from Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. This is the end of the first movement. This is a really big clarinet excerpt that shows up on literally every clarinet orchestra audition. And again, looking at the score will reveal exactly why this excerpt needs to be played a certain way, with certain dynamics, certain tempo, etc., etc. So in that specific excerpt, you'll see that there are moments where you're playing, but it's full orchestra, and then moments where you're playing and you're all alone. So you need to know that to make the right calls for dynamics, the right calls for articulations, etc., etc. So context is really, really important, not just for orchestral excerpts, but really for anything. Knowing the piece inside and out, so you can make the right judgment call as to what dynamic you're going to do here, what articulation, what kind of accent. All those little tiny details rely on you knowing the context of whatever it is that you're doing. So let's move on now to just some general ideas I have for articulation. There's a lot of things that we can do to practice to develop articulation, all sorts of exercises, but none of that means anything if the tongue is not moving the way it's supposed to be moving, if we're not touching the right place on the reed with the right place of the tongue. So always remember this very basic rule, tip to tip, the very tip of the tongue to the very tip of the reed. So the tip of the tongue is just the very frontmost part of your tongue to the very tip of your reed, all the way, I'm not sure if this is in focus, but all the way up here, almost feeling that knife edge of the reed on the little bitty tip of your tongue. So that's step one. And you might want to reference the video I did for the beginner students. That video is Basics Bootcamp, where I talk about the tongue position, which ties in to articulation. So if the tongue position is this, we arch the tongue inside the mouth, that puts your tongue at the right place to articulate. If the tongue is flat in the mouth, articulation becomes more difficult. But if your tongue is arched in the mouth, it becomes really easy to just move the very tip of the tongue to the tip of the reed. So once you have your tongue position and tongue placement correct, then you can start really working and developing your articulation. I suspect that you guys already know how to tongue, so I'll show you one exercise that I do as kind of a tongue warm-up, and to also really push and develop some speed. So this is a really basic exercise, and let me just demonstrate it. So let me just set my metronome. There we go. So the rhythm of this exercise is 4/16 notes quarter, 4/16 notes quarter, and then 3 groups of 4/16 notes and a quarter, and you repeat that, repeat that, repeat that until you feel your tongue really start to get fatigued and tired. So I'm going to do this at 126. Etc., etc. So you do that several times, about a minute or so, and you want to do this every day at a tempo that you feel comfortable at, or a tempo that you can just barely squeak by at. And you're going to do that every day until that one tempo feels really good, and then you're going to move your tempo up a little bit to another tempo where you can barely get by, and repeat the process. This is a really simple exercise to develop really quick, light tongue. The most important thing for tonguing, and I think this is not talked about enough, is that to articulate, we don't rely too much on the tongue muscle, but really we rely on the air pressure and having the air do the right thing to allow the tongue to just really lightly bounce off the reed. So again, maybe refer to the other video in this series to hear my thoughts about how to support and how to blow correctly. But in order for tonguing to work, the air and air pressure have to be really, really intense. A lot of air pressure to allow the tongue to just bounce ever so lightly off the reed. So remember, it's not about the tongue muscle, not the tongue strength, but the air pressure that allows the tongue to be very light on the reed. For tonguing, I like to use really light words and syllables like D or do or thee. I really like to avoid tu or ta. When we say ta, that opens up your jaw, ta, ta. and that will give you some really muddy articulations, articulations that sound really scoopy or really harsh and hollow sounding. For example, ta ta ta, the whole jaw moves. We want to keep the jaw still so that we don't affect how we produce a tone on the clarinet. So by saying things like D or the or do even is a really light one, those will keep your jaw and sound production mechanism in place. If you're tonguing with the is a really good one. That's T-H-E-E, because if you say the and think about where your tongue goes in the mouth when you say the tongue goes right between the teeth. And if you think about when you're playing, what goes between your teeth when we play? The reed and the mouthpiece. So by saying the, that puts your tongue, puts the tip of your tongue exactly where you want it to be in the mouth to articulate in a better way. So again, the, D, do, all really light articulations will help you achieve a really light tongue. And then once you develop your tongue and learn how to use your air, then you can start doing more advanced articulations like really short notes or really separated notes. But all those articulations rely on your air being really strong and your articulation being light. And with those two things, you can achieve any articulation length, any articulation style. And finally, the last thing I want to touch on is how to have a better practice session, how to be more effective and efficient, and how to get through a really long practice session. So it's always a really good idea to start any practice session with some goals in mind. 1, 2, 3, whatever it may be. If you're practicing for a long time, you can have a lot of goals. If you're practicing for a short amount of time, you can have just a few. But it's always important to have goals in mind when you practice. Today I'm going to work on this passage. Today I'm going to get this passage up to whatever tempo. It doesn't matter, but have goals, because goals give you direction and it gives you a really clear idea of what you need to do that day and how much time you need to spend to do it. Practicing really effectively and efficiently is really important now, because we don't all have so much time to practice. No one wants to practice, hours and hours and hours a day in a practice room all alone. We don't want to do that. So the more you practice effectively, the more efficient you'll be. And that means if there's something really easy and comfortable for you, don't spend time on it. That's a waste of your time. You're just wasting time practicing that. It becomes playing at that point. So separating practicing from playing. Playing is what we do after we've practiced. Playing is the reward. Playing is just playing straight through it. Practicing is sitting down, finding issues, fixing the little problems, things like that, being really focused and detail-oriented and really zoned in and intense. Playing is what we do kind of by rote or by memory once we get to that point. Being mindful versus mindless. This idea I talk a lot about with my younger students. Mindful versus mindless. When you think about those two words, what comes to mind? For me, mindless is just doing things by rote. I'm playing and I'm thinking about something completely different. What's my cat doing? What am I going to eat later? Things like that. You're not really engaged. But mindful practice is where you're really engaged, you're zoned in, you're fixing every little problem, you're really hyper-focused on every little detail. And that's what's really effective. That's a really effective way to practice. And finally, the importance of breaks when you're practicing, when you're having a long practice session or a long rehearsal. It's really important to take breaks. When I'm practicing, I like to take 10 minutes off for every hour I practice. So for every hour chunk of my practice, I'm playing for about 50 minutes straight, and then I take 10 minutes off. I leave the room, I put the clarinet down, I get away from the environment where I'm practicing completely so that I'm away from that stressor or aggressor that's causing me to feel anxious or whatever it may be that you feel when you practice. So I leave the room, I clear my head, I go sit in the sun, I go sit quietly, I check whatever, Instagram, Facebook, whatever it is. Just get away from music, get away from the clarinet, and then when you come back, you'll have a fresher mind and you'll be playing a whole lot better. It's really, really important to get away from the instrument and take breaks. Same idea for rehearsals. When you're in a really heavy, intense rehearsal, you need to take a break, first of all, to give yourself some rest, but also to clear your head. So yes, we want to practice, but we also want to take breaks when we practice. We need time to rest. We need time to decompress, to just think about something else so that when you come back to it, everything's going to be a lot more fresh, and you're going to be playing and sounding a whole lot better after a break. I guarantee it. It's 100%. So I hope that video was helpful for you. You might have known some of this information already, or this might have been new. If you knew this already, it's always good to reinforce these ideas and habits. And that's it for today. So happy practicing, and I'll see you guys later. Thanks.